Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I'm Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson. Before we kick off this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we'd like to ask you a favor. If you're coming back to the show because you enjoyed previous episodes, or if you're coming back to the show for the first time or coming to the show for the first time, please click the subscribe button and the notification bell now. By subscribing and hitting the bell, you'll be notified of each new post, and you'll really help us to build the channel into something more special than what we already think it's become. We also hope that you'll check out our website, thebigbaspodcast.com. There you'll find all of our shows, special bonus materials, our exclusive Big Bass Podcast calculator, and lists of all the state and world record bass. So let's get started, Ken.
Terry, this episode of the Big Bass Podcast takes us to Tennessee and North Carolina and probably Georgia. It's hard to say, and it really depends on who you ask, but we're going to be talking about tournament fishing in this episode. We're going to be talking about pet bass, but we're definitely also going to be talking about big bass because, well, that's what we do here. And we're going to tell the story of a fish that held a state record for less time than any other bass that was legitimately caught and not actually surpassed in weight.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting story for a lot of people, I think. The angler that Ken's alluding to is a gentleman by the name of David Presley, who was born in 1950, lived much of his life in East Tennessee. He was married, lived in a town called Etowah, Tennessee, and he fished. The guy was a fisherman. I mean, this is, not a Dave Zimmerly who apparently, might not have been fishing that long when he caught a 20-pounder. This is a guy that not only fished 70 times for a year, but he belonged to a bass club back in 1976. So you've got to be pretty dang serious. But the other interesting thing is that up until this day in time, his biggest fish was only a 5-pound fish. So the day is March 27th, 1976. It's a Saturday. He's fishing a club tournament. Presley was 25 years old at the time, and he was fishing this tournament with the McMinn County Bassmasters at a place called Lake Chatuge, which just so happens to lie half in North Carolina and half in Georgia. Now, how do you plan that? The lake's got all the bass species. Back then, it had largemouth, but it was predominantly a smallmouth lake. And in 73, the record was set there with a 7-pound, 2-ounce smallmouth, which is a dang nice smallmouth, especially in the hills of Tennessee. Now the lake has pretty much been run over by spots. They got a lake record out of there in 2003 that weighed 6 pounds, 13.8 ounces. And Ken, why don't you bring us on into this tournament that happened that glorious Saturday?
Absolutely, Terry. As you mentioned, the McMinn County Bass Club was having a tournament on Chatuge. They voted to have a one-day event out there, and a lot of the guys in the club were not that excited about it. They had gone there once before, in January of the year before, and 40 anglers had only caught 3 bass in that tournament. They were also not exactly happy about it because, according to David Presley, the angler who's the focus of our story today, he said it's a long, mountainous haul, and some didn't feel it was worth the trip. But eventually they all agreed, and they decided to go there, mainly because Chatuge had been producing some giant largemouth bass. In fact, guys in the club had reported 3 fish over 12 pounds and another over 10 just that calendar year, just since January.
In 1976. Yeah, that's
in 1976.
Those are some tanks. Yeah.
Monster fish out of that part of the world. And the bass tournament launched on the North Carolina side. As you mentioned, this body of water is half in North Carolina and half in Georgia. And right off the bat, Presley and his partner have problems. His outboard won't start. And I think you and I, we've been there, haven't we, Terry?
Never. I've never had problems with my outboard.
Good to know. Good to know. Well, what started out, what they thought was an outboard problem really was more specifically a battery problem. And so they eased around the trolling motor for a while before figuring out what the real situation was. And then Presley replaced his outboard battery to start the motor with his truck battery. And they got actually started for the tournament at about 2 o'clock. And realistically, I think they probably had, everybody has about a 3 or 4 o'clock weigh-in. So they didn't have long to fish. And it was going to be a really short day for them. So they made a really short run. Presley's confident they're in North Carolina. He had some spots marked in Georgia that he wanted to hit, but he didn't think he could get back to the ramp in time for the weigh-in. So they make a really short run. He's throwing a crankbait. And earlier, when they were just running around with a trolling motor, he had caught a smallmouth bass that weighed about a buck and a half. And he's fishing riprap, Terry. He's fishing riprap with a well-known crankbait that we'll get into in a minute, but he gets a bite. Tell us about the bite.
Yeah, he says, I knew it was a good one right off because it easily pulled the drag that I'd set rather tight. I was about to add more drag when the fish came to the surface and swirled. I decided to let the fish go and not risk it breaking off a tighter line. The bass turned and came to the boat, and Wayne tried to net it but missed. It then ran towards the motor in a very obvious attempt to cut loose, like a fish knows it's going to go to the motor.
Yeah, why do people always say that, Terry? As though a fish understands a connection, a tether of some kind.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, I'm going to hit that prop. But I horsed the rod and the line and turned the fish. Wayne swept the net under it and muscled it to the bottom of the boat. It was exactly 2:10 p.m.
And, of course, Wayne is his partner, the back of the boat guy, because they're fishing out of Presley's boat.
Yep.
Now, the fight didn't last long, 2-3 minutes, and then Presley says the size of the fish, simply overwhelmed me. My knees really buckled, and I couldn't fish anymore. I get it. So after the catch, it's 2:10, probably a 3 o'clock weigh-in, and so they stop fishing.
Yeah.
They stop fishing. Let's take a break from the blow-by-blow action here, Terry, and talk about the gear, because Presley was fishing some good stuff for 1976.
Oh yeah, he was right up there. He had a Rebel Deep We Are crankbait and crawdad, a Fenwick lunker stick, an Abu Ambassador 5000C, and 14-pound Stren fluorescent monofilament. I mean, that was the high-end equipment of the day. You couldn't get any better.
It certainly was, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, Terry, to see if you agree with me. The Deep We Are was the deep diving crankbait. That and the DB3, the Bagley DB3, were the deep diving crankbaits of the 70s. Everybody had them.
Yeah, it was like American Express. You didn't leave home without them. I mean, they were the number one, number two. You might want to throw a Norman in there, but Bagley's and
Norman
and
Deep
Rebel
Little Ann, sure.
Yeah, he had the right stuff. So.
Now, immediately after he catches the fish, they stop fishing. They're done. He's too fired up, too excited. His knees are not working. And there's a little confusion in the reports as to whether or not the next thing they did was go to the weigh-in or find a game warden. Mm-hmm. But in any event, one thing that's worth mentioning, we'll mention it here, get out of the way, they won the tournament. They won the tournament. They didn't even need that pound and a half smallmouth, Terry. The fish weighed 16 pounds, 12 ounces, that largemouth. That was enough to win. So they flagged down a game warden. And the first game warden he sees, he thinks he's in North Carolina, but lo and behold, the first game warden they run into is a Georgia Wildlife Conservation Corporal with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, a guy by the name of Dan Garland. Mm-hmm. And that should be your first red flag as to where he might be fishing here. Now Garland is able to see they've got a massive fish, and the first thing he does is call a Georgia fisheries biologist, a state fisheries biologist out of the Gainesville office. Now I used to live in Gainesville, Georgia, and I can tell you it's a couple of hours, and not an easy drive to Chattooga. So either this guy that he called, the biologist, Joe Fatora, was either working in the area or they waited hours for him to show up. But when Fatora gets there, he takes our angler, David Presley, to a general store in Blairsville, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And Terry, it's a massive fish.
Yeah, the fish, on a certified scale, weighs 16 pounds, 12 ounces. It's 25 and a half inches long, 25 inches in girth. You got Tom Higgins is the outdoor editor for the Charlotte Observers there. Acceptance of Presley's petition for a North Carolina record appears a mere formality. And then
Everybody's on his side.
Presley's quoted as saying, Ken, I know it's going to sound confusing. Here's a Tennessee fisherman setting a North Carolina record and having it checked in by Georgia officials. But that's the way it happened. So,
at this point, after the catch, Perry's saying we were well on the North Carolina side. Mm-hmm. The reason I know this is because I'd had motor trouble and couldn't run to the Georgia side. And of course, after all this happens, after he gets it weighed, it's witnessed by a biologist, not a North Carolina biologist, but a Georgia official state biologist, witnessed by a Georgia game warden. When Presley wins the tournament, he takes that fish home, puts it in the freezer, makes an appointment with a taxidermist. Life is good.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And at this point, some of the media are on it. And as Terry quoted a guy from the Charlotte Observer, acceptance of this fish is a formality. It's going to be a done deal. This is easy.
Yeah.
It's been seen by so many authority figures. This is easy. One of the newspaper guys winds up calling BASS in Montgomery, Alabama. And depending on which report you buy into, he either spoke to Harold Sharp, the longtime BASS tournament director, or Bob Cobb, the longtime editor of Bassmaster magazine, who each told him, oh, this is a world record for any bass tournament, a world record for a bass tournament. But then he said something, Bob Cobb apparently said something a little shakier. Tell us about that, Terry.
Yeah, so Cobb's quoted as saying, this fish means much more than a mere state record, though, as far as we can determine, and we have very extensive statistics. It is the fourth largest bigmouth bass ever weighed anywhere in the world.
Wrong. I don't want to say Bob Cobb was ever wrong, because Bob Cobb walks on ground I worship because he's Bob Cobb. He's a legend. He's amazing. He's wonderful. He's awesome. But that was a mistake. And multiple reports at that time were saying that Presley's fish at 16 pounds, 12 ounces was either the fourth or the fifth biggest largemouth bass ever caught anywhere in the world at any time. And realistically, Terry, Presley's fish ranked about 8th.
Yeah, it was in the top 10, but it wasn't
top 10.
the fourth.
And imagine that, because, folks, if you go now, if you would go all the way down to a 16-pound, 12-ounce bass today, I don't know where that fish would rank, but I think it would be very lucky to rank in the top 500 or 600.
Yeah.
But back then, it would have ranked probably among certified, legitimate fish. It probably would have ranked no worse than 8th. And of course, we're talking George Perry's world record out of Georgia from 1932. We're talking Dave Zimmerle's 2015 out of California in 73. Another over 20 by Fritz Friebel and a few others. But the fish is destined. Everybody agrees it's destined to be the new North Carolina state record. And at the time, the North Carolina state record was a 14-pound, 15-ounce fish caught by a fishing guide named Leonard Williams from Santitla Lake in 1963. And this guy was legit. This guy Leonard Williams is a fishing guide out there, and he also had. Not only did he have the largemouth record, Terry, he had the walleye record and the white bass record. Wow! And bad news for Leonard Williams, who has long since passed away, but he doesn't have any of those records anymore. No.
Yeah, because the record now is a 15-14 taken by William Wolford, Union County Farm Pond in 1991, and it weighs almost nearly, a pound less than Presley's fish.
Yeah, so, Presley's fish at 16-12, had it been, could have been still the state record in North Carolina. It's a massive, massive fish. But since it was caught in a border lake, you have all kinds of confusion that we're about to get into. Yeah. An interesting thing to me, Terry, is that in 1976, state bass records were just falling like dominoes. I don't know if there's ever been a period of time, of a 3-month period of time when so many state records fell. We've got Illinois record falling on February 1st. Alabama's goes down on February 25th. Arkansas on March 2nd. We're going to tell all those stories eventually. And, of course, David Presley has what we think is going to be a new North Carolina record on March 27th. And lo and behold, to absolutely no one's surprise, what happens on April 4th? He's got the state record.
Yep.
It's confirmed.
And, possibly deservedly so. But we're going to get into that, right?
That's where we got to go, because this is the Big Bass Podcast, folks. We leave no stone unturned.
Yep.
No stone unturned.
So we got a little bit of controversy that we've kind of alluded to coming up to this point. So let's get into that, Ken.
Yeah, you must have seen it coming by now, folks, but we've got a problem. And that problem was this fish caught on the North Carolina side of Lake Chattooga or on the Georgia side of Lake Chattooga? Because it's going to make a big, big difference. Now, at the time, believe it or not, the records were kept by the North Carolina Division of Travel and Economic Development. One guy was in charge of the records, and his name was Joel Arrington.
I think it's better to have writers, the state writers. I mean, if you got to choose one over the other, Ken, the guy that does the travel, I mean, come on. Does he even fish?
That's a good point. I hadn't considered that, but I'm horrified that it would be left to outdoor writers, because I am one. But the guy decided, it wasn't carved in stone, but the guy made a decision at some point that because the fish was not caught in North Carolina waters, or because there was controversy, there needed to be an investigation. And folks, you should know, every state, of course, has its own rules, its own record keepers, its own regulations, its own everything. And in North Carolina, if your fish is not caught in state waters, it cannot be given record consideration. In Georgia, it's got to be caught in state waters, or it won't be given consideration. In Kentucky, for example, you got to be caught in state waters to be given record consideration. But Terry, in your home state of Tennessee, not so much.
Well, but that's the curious thing, is that you look at David Hayes' smallmouth record that came out of Dale Hollow. That lake resides in both Kentucky and in Tennessee.
And ironically, about 90% of it's in Tennessee.
And both states claim the record. And
but Kentucky claims it properly. Tennessee just kind of usurps it.
So actually the fish was caught in Kentucky.
The fish was caught in Kentucky. That's what David Hayes told me.
Okay. All right.
And I believe him. Mm-hmm. But that's an issue. Where was this fish caught? And there's going to be an investigation. Meanwhile, after the whole controversy about where the fish came from begins, we've got another controversy that pops up. And that is whether or not this was truly a wild fish, or was it actually a pet bass at a place called Stroop's Boat Dock in the state of Georgia.
Yeah. If you've got this Bassmaster issue dating back to, what was it, the September-October issue?
76. Yeah.
76. It goes into this pretty deep. There are people that are claiming that worked on Stroop's Boat Dock, that this fish was their pet. And, they'd go down and they would, feed it water dogs or crawdads or, bologna sandwiches, pretty much eat anything. Cheese balls. And, this fish was their pet, and every once in a while, someone would go out and catch it, and they'd take a picture with it, and they'd weigh it, and let it go back, and I call bullshit on that.
Who catches a nearly 17-pound bass and releases it?
No, nobody.
Nobody. I tell you what, folks, if anybody out there listening has a 17-pound pet bass and would like to tell me about it and give me a chance to catch it, I'm keeping your fish. I'm not releasing it. It's going home with me. It's going to the taxidermist. If it's a state record, I'm going to take it to a state biologist. That fish suddenly becomes mine. But one of the curious things about that too is, obviously it isn't always the case, but when you hear about these people with big pet bass, those fish are usually all but impossible to catch. They've seen so many baits fall by them, so many even live bait with a hook and a line coming out of it, that they know the difference, and they're almost never caught. But
so was the fish caught next to Stroops? I mean,
no, according to the witnesses there, that fish was caught maybe 75 yards away, but there were some distinguishing characteristics about the fish. First of all, it weighed almost 17 pounds.
Right.
And you got to believe there ain't many of those in Lake Chattooga. Second, it was the pet fish was blind in one eye, and Presley's fish was blind in one eye. So there's a pretty good chance that this fish was the pet bass that they used to call Old Scaly. Old Scaly. It's at Stroop Stock that they have been feeding for 8 years.
Oh, God.
But one thing I'll say on behalf of and defense of and support of the folks at the dock was they did not begrudge him catching the fish. They were cool with that, especially since he caught it apparently some distance away from the dock. It's not like he was throwing at the dock, apparently, at that time. He caught it off some riprap some distance away. One of the guys working at the dock claimed he had a picture of it. What they were griped about was that he was saying he caught it in North Carolina, when in fact, since it was so close to their dock, they're saying it was roughly 2 miles south of the border in Georgia. In fact, one of the guys at the dock said it's kind of upsetting that Presley knew he couldn't get a Georgia record, so he tried to get one from North Carolina.
Wow.
And the outdoor editor for the Asheville Citizen-Times, a North Carolina newspaper, of course, when this story came out, ran a headline. He was mostly griped about the pet, but also the location. And his headline, which we'll show you, says, "Record catch, now record hoax."
Oh, God.
Which I thought was pretty harsh.
Yeah.
But Presley was with us, Terry. Presley's response to these allegations of it being a pet bass were, he said, "You tell me how many people would catch a 16-pound bass anywhere and then release it."
Yeah.
I'm with him.
He's absolutely right. I know I wouldn't. I mean, in today's, bass fishing, I'd take a picture of it, I'd weigh it, I'd take measurements of it, and then I would release it. In 1976, hell no, that thing's going in the live well, it's going to get weighed, and then it's going to go in the freezer to get skin mounted.
And that's exactly what he did with it.
Yeah.
Exactly what he did with it. Well, as this controversy starts to brew, the pet bass thing comes up, the location of the catch comes up. North Carolina decides they want an investigation on this fish. And who do they get to do it? Well, they get the Georgia game warden guy, Dan Garland. They let him head things up. And they assign a North Carolina protector to help him out with this investigation. And Garland has some pretty damning things to say about Presley.
Interesting.
Perhaps the ugliest, and I'll read a couple of the quotes here. He's talking about David Presley here. Mm-hmm. He asked me a whole lot of suspicious questions as we were going to get the bass certified. He wanted to know about the North Carolina record and what the Georgia record was. I told him about everything, but I knew from taking one look at that fish that it was Old Scaly from down at Stroop's boat dock. And Garland concluded that he knew, he said Presley knew he was on the Georgia side at the time. And to the best of Garland's knowledge, Presley was never fished in North Carolina waters that entire day. And when all this comes out, to a degree, Terry, Presley comes clean.
That's amazing.
He says, okay, he admitted he caught the fish within 75 yards of the dock and that was inside Georgia waters. Mm-hmm. But he still denies prior to that knowing that he was in Georgia. So Garland, the Georgia game warden, makes a recommendation to North Carolina that they not accept the fish as a state record, that they invalidate the fish that they had certified as a state record on April 4th, and now, exactly a month later, what do?
Take it away.
They take it away. They take it away.
Poor guy. Oh,
Joel Arrington, the tourism guy who's in charge of state fishing records, even writes him a letter. And I know you've seen the segments from that letter.
Yep. Yeah, it says, this is to advise that you are regretfully invalidating your largemouth bass record, although it was caught from a lake shared by North Carolina and Georgia. This is because, by your own admission in a phone conversation, it was caught from the Georgia side of the lake. To recognize, it would set a dangerous precedent. We would have to recognize fish caught from rivers that we share with neighboring states, even if they were caught outside of North Carolina. It also raises the silly question of whether we would recognize on our saltwater list fish caught out of Virginia or South Carolina, since the Atlantic Ocean, in a sense, is shared with those states. And then Bassmaster, go ahead with a Bassmaster.
well, Bassmaster got some quotes from Arrington, and in which he said that the pet bass stuff had nothing to do with the decision. It was all about location, about where the fish was caught, and that he didn't let anybody else sway him. His entire decision was based on his correspondence with Presley, which I thought was interesting since he sanctioned an investigation by Garland. But oh well.
Yeah.
This did not make David Presley happy.
No.
And he pushed back a little bit. He was not happy about being disqualified there. He felt like, since it came from a border body of water, Chattooga, that it should be considered for North Carolina record status. And Terry, I know we've chuckled about some of the comments he made.
Yeah. It's like one of the comments that I laughed about was Presley saying that those game and fish people in Raleigh didn't even know there was such a lake as Chattooga when I first called. They called me back the next day. I guess they had found it on a map. Anyhow, they wanted to record the fish in their books. And then he goes on to say, I, about halfway, believe they're jealous that an outsider came in and caught a bass that big. Once they started hollering, North Carolina decided it wouldn't want anything to do with the record.
Yeah, and he also, he was being a little bit cocky there, saying, hey, I caught this fish fair and square on a lure, and there's some big fish in that lake. I plan to catch me another one. David Presley passed away in July of 2016 in his longtime home in Shelbyville, Tennessee. He is buried in Willow Mount Cemetery in Bedford County. So one of these days, Terry, if I'm in the neighborhood, I may pay my respects to Mr. Presley, who for a month at least had the North Carolina state record for largemouth bass. And you and I won't soon forget that.
No. Golly, what do we do about this? I mean, we've harped on this in previous shows. You need to understand the regulations if you're going to file for a record fish in any state. Don't assume that shared waters is a rule. Real estate and fishing have a lot in common. It's all location. And,
I wonder what North Carolina would have done if it had been a world record. I wonder if North Carolina would have changed their rules and said, yeah, we want a piece of this record.
That's an interesting thing, because they would have been taking it away from Georgia, right?
Well, they would have shared it with Georgia.
Well, Maybe not. Maybe they would have, said, "Oh no, we trust this guy that he caught the fish out of North Carolina," and then they're taking it away from Georgia. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, I think if they could have claimed taking it away, they had jumped all over that. Mm-hmm. Jumped all over that.
Yeah, but the other interesting thing is is this a Florida bass? If it's not a Florida bass, it's another, big. It's got to be northern.
Right, it's got to be the biggest northern of all time.
Yeah, which gives the Massachusetts fish some credibility.
Yeah, we're talking about the Walter Balonis fish from just a year before this.
Yep.
We'll put a link to that episode here. Walter Balonis, Miracle on Ice. Balonis caught a 15-8 through the ice in Massachusetts in February 1975.
Yep.
Unless somebody had taken a Florida fish and put it in that Massachusetts pond, you got to assume that was a northern largemouth. Who knows?
Yeah.
Of course, now I believe the Florida, I'm not a biologist by any means, but I believe the Florida largemouth ranges well into the state of Georgia, the Florida strain largemouth. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say that they naturally go as high as where Chatoog is.
Yeah, because it's like at 3,000 feet, right?
Well, Chatoog is up there, but perhaps more critically, Chatoog is a man-made reservoir. It is not a place where it would have been flowing water when Florida largemouths would have had to have been there if they were there naturally. And that seems unlikely. And so maybe they were introduced through some bucket biology.
That's possible, but did anybody even really know what Florida bass were? Well, obviously
they did.
They knew in
Bailey
59.
and Hubbs knew. Bailey and Hubbs knew in 49. In 49 they knew, yeah. And who knows, if we get our hands on the skin mount, and we believe that Mr. Presley's widow is still alive, if we get our hands on the skin mount, maybe we can get a
scale
test
and
done.
do some DNA. Yep.
There you go. All right, folks, let's get an APB out on the Presley mount and see if we can't get that thing and do some study. We'll get to the bottom of some of these big fish stories.
Yep. Cool. Well, Ken, I think it's about time to wrap this one up, don't you?
I do, but you know what? I think I just got to say one more thing, Terry, and I've been waiting for this. I've been waiting for this. Here we go.
Oh.
All about Mr. Presley, remember. When the McMinn County Bass Club decided to fish a one-day tournament at Lake Chatoog, they avoided an overnight stay at Heartbreak Hotel. David Presley and his partner had battery problems that left them screaming, "Don't be cruel." But once they got on the water and Presley caught his giant bass, he was all shook up. His efforts to get his fish recognized were going well. He must have thought, "They love me tender." He had a new North Carolina state record largemouth bass that was a hunka burning love. Oh. Even though the fish was actually a block of ice in his freezer waiting for the taxidermist. Unfortunately, the Georgia and North Carolina authorities started an investigation into the catch and eventually said to Presley, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog lying all the time about where you caught that fish." Plus, folks in that area said the bass was really their pet, a fish that just wanted to be your teddy bear. In the end, North Carolina stepped all over Presley's blue suede shoes and took away the state record after exactly 1 month. The moral of the story: if you're gonna fudge on the facts about a potential record catch, better make sure you're not surrounded by a lot of suspicious minds ready to investigate, or you could find yourself doing the jailhouse rock.
Wow. How could you back that one up?
All right, I apologize to anybody who waited this deep into the show to listen to that. I apologize. Are we ready, Terry? Are you ready?
We're ready, Ken. Go ahead.
All right, man. It's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But before we go, please remember to subscribe, like, share, give us a comment or a review. It's a small ask, but it really is a big help. And don't forget to check out our website. At thebigbasspodcast.com, you'll find our Big Bass Podcast Calculator and our listings of record bass plus supplementary material on the episodes. It's admittedly a work in progress, but if you like the show, you'll love thebigbaspodcast.com. And if you want to contact us, we'd love to hear from you, truly. Our email addresses are ken@thebigbaspodcast.com, Terry@thebigbaspodcast.com, Nathan@thebigbaspodcast.com. I'm Ken Duke, and on behalf of my partners Terry Battisti and Nathan Benson, thanks for joining us. Next week we'll have a new show about a different big bass with a story that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. And remember, size matters.